And these details make the wheels look a bit more like the wheels of some siege engine, some big monstrous thing.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Inspired by my own ideas last week, I decided to build this massive battering ram that could completely take down a castle gate. Although I don't really have any castle pieces or anything for it to siege. I started off with a bunch of popsicle sticks, of course, and I'm using 4 popsicle sticks here and laminating them all together to give me some thick pieces of wood. Normally you would do this with XPS foam, but I'm just showing you that you can do it with popsicle sticks too. This will make up the main frame, and I make 4 of these just to have some extra. And then I get to work making the wheels. Just like last week, I used this dropper bottle to make a wheel shape out of a single corrugated piece of cardboard. Then I cut that out into a nice clean circle shape, and then stick on some popsicle sticks. To give the popsicle sticks a much more pronounced texture, I use this file with a really rough and big notches, and I run the popsicle sticks along the face to give it some really nice pronounced texture. I do this to a bunch of popsicle sticks that I'm going to use for this project, and a couple spare just in case. And of course, because the wheels are going to be stuck down on one side, I only need to do texturing on one side of the popsicle stick. Sometimes you'll have to do it on both sides. After that is all well and dry, I come in with some wood clippers and some cutters, and I cut that to shape. The shape is a bit lopsided and wonky, mainly because the single corrugated cardboard piece that I cut isn't a perfect circle. If you're really looking for a real perfect circle, I'd suggest using a piece of chipboard. That way you get a much more sturdy and round base. But this shape works just fine for me for this rickety old machine. And once I got all of those dry, I line them up with my cutting mat, and I mark 2 at 4 inches each, and that'll be the 2 sides. And then I mark pieces to go in the center that will make the entire piece 2 inches. The piece in the center was roughly 1.5 inches, if I remember correctly. And then I head over to my vise and use a saw to cut those out. The cuts are pretty lopsided, and if you have a miter box, this would be the perfect place to use it. And after sanding off the edges to make it a bit more smooth, I use that file again to just rip up a bunch of texture in the wood. And this wood comes off really well, especially with such a big piece. You can really work it and get some really nice textures. And then I stick those together using tacky glue. That way it bonds pretty quickly. For giving these wheels a bit more texture, I use a cap of a super glue bottle. I keep all the little nibbly knobbly bits that they give, and I cut the cap off just to make it look like a little metal cap at the end that would like hold the axle in or something like that. It's a bit too big, so I just trim it down a little bit and stick that on. And adding little tiny details like this makes it look pretty cool. And I'll keep that little ring piece. Who knows what I'll use it for. I then use these tiny little coffee stir sticks to add some banding along the edges as well. And compared to last time, I think these wheels look even more like they belong on a big old siege tank. Using a couple of those popsicle sticks that I textured up before, I add on the little struts that will hold up the entire battering ram, as well as the little roof we'll put on top at the end. And I measure these, one at each end and then one roughly in the center. And this is where having a cutting mat measured in inches is really nice, because you can just line it up with the cutting mat. I was going to make the frame a little bit more complicated, but the more framing you put on, the less you're going to see inside the little mechanism that we're building. So I think a very simple frame has worked great for now. Make sure to absolutely load up any gaps with glue as well, and that'll make sure that it stays nice and sturdy for the rest of its life. And then to build the big log in the center, I was going to use a stick I found, but the stick ended up being a bit too big to fit. So instead I'll make my own log. Using this piece of wooden dowel, I just wrap it in aluminium foil, and this texturing is the same as the one on the modular tree set I made a real long time ago. Now, the PVA glue here takes really long time to dry, so I'd suggest doing this and letting it sit for at least 2 or 3 days. If you're in a really hot climate, it'll set even faster. And with stuff like this, of course, it's always the really small details that make it look cooler. So I cut off this tiny little piece of ear cleaner. It's like rivets almost. And I glue those anywhere that a nail would slot in and hold the wood together. And later on, I'll come in and paint those in a gunmetal grey. Then I use a piece of cereal box cardstock and I cover that corrugation around the edges of all the wheels. And this is really what makes it look like a big siege weapon. Real menacing, big iron bands around the wheels. I did try to make the wheels spinnable by drilling holes into the edges and hoping that friction would do a lot of the work for me, but it ended up being a bit too tight and not really working the way I wanted. So all this does, in the end, is space the wheels out a little bit from the edge. Which is good because that's what it would look like, but unfortunately the wheels, while they can spin, it is not very well at all. This does mean it's really easy to paint though, because I can just take it apart. And I paint the entire thing, all the pieces, in a burnt sienna first off. And I give this a real heavy coat, getting into all of the little places, because it's so open, you're really going to be able to see a lot of areas from any direction that you look. So you want to make sure to cover absolutely everything and try to get a really good coverage. But even then, if you miss some spots, a dry brush is going to easily catch those later on. And for the rope that'll hang in between and hold the piece up, I use this brick line, which is a really nice texture. It's really fine and really compact. However, it is bright yellow. So I cover all of that in a brown burnt sienna as well. And then for the big log, in order to give it a bit more detail, I got some rings of cardstock and wrapped those around the edges. And then I give it all a dry brush of a brighter burnt sienna. I just mix a little bit of white yellow with the burnt sienna. And especially after paint has gotten into those little holes, the friction is a lot higher and it's a lot tighter. So it's even more difficult to spin. Which is a shame. It would have been nice to spin, but it's fine that it doesn't. I finish off painting all of those bandings with a bit of gunmetal grey around the log. And then using that string, I'll just tie it up and hang it from the struts that we put up the top. I am not good with knots at all, so I have no idea what I'm doing. And I touch it up with some super glue just to make sure it doesn't all fall apart. Now, a lot of battering rams have roofs as well. That way you can be inside, underneath, and push the battering ram and you won't get hit by enemy arrow fire. So I cut off just some smaller pieces of popsicle stick and I lean those in. And that'll make the nice basic structure to make the slanted roof. And then I use those, again, those really tiny coffee stir sticks that I got, and I just line them along the top. It doesn't really matter what you use here, you can use popsicle sticks again, because on top of those, we're going to put shingles. Pretty alright, just those, but I want to add shingles to it as well, so I'm just going to cut and trim all the excess off the edge. And then I'll give it a paint job in the brown because in case any pieces show through, I still want to have that main brown color. And I'll get in underneath and paint that brown as well in case it ever flips over or is tipped on its side. And then using a bunch of cereal box cardstock, I've got all of these tiny little squares cut out for shingles. And thankfully, I didn't need to cut any more shingles for this project because these are all leftovers from previous ones. And I just start laying them down. And this is all just the same as how I laid shingles down in my house project ages ago. I then go over the top on the very edge and add these much thicker ones to cover that ugly seam. Now normally I give these a coat of black Mod Podge as a base, and I didn't do that here because I didn't really want to mess around with that with all the other pieces already painted. So I give it a coat of red, just the base color, and I give it a couple of coats of that because it goes on pretty translucent, to be honest. But that also keeps the shingles looking a bit different. So the different colors of the underground, the like basic pieces, kind of shine through in that red. So some are darker and some are brighter, which looks nice. I then give it a dry brush of a bright orange to add a bit more highlights to the edges of all the shingles. And I don't specifically have anything big to test it against, but I imagine it'll do pretty well sieging a castle and absolutely battering down the doors. See all those real tiny details that we've carved in and added on really add a lot and make it look a lot cooler. And this big thing, I do not want to see it coming anywhere near my front door. Thanks for watching to the end.